Two men, two dictators, two monsters, who together caused the deaths of more than 30 million people. One was a failed art student who became the most feared man in Europe. The other was a poor cobbler's son who climbed to power over the dead bodies of anyone who stood in his way. For years, they smiled at each other, shook hands, signed treaties, and then one of them made a decision so catastrophic, so arrogant, so absolutely insane, that would set the entire world on fire. And when it was finally over, cities were rubble, families were ash, and the map of the entire world had been redrawn forever. This is not just a war story. This is the story of what happens when two of the most dangerous men in history decide to destroy each other. Before we talk about the war, we need to understand the two men at the center of it. Because to understand this conflict, you need to understand that this was not just a war between two countries. This was a clash of two ideologies, two personalities, two men who were, in many ways, terrifyingly similar. Adolf Hitler, born 1889 in Austria, dreamed of being an artist, was rejected twice from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, spent his youth homeless, sleeping in shelters, eating at charity kitchens, filled with rage and resentment, looking for someone to blame. He found his answer in politics, in hatred, in the idea that Germany's humiliation after World War I was the fault of Jews, communists, and weak leaders. He rose from a homeless nobody to the Chancellor of Germany in just over a decade. By 1939, he controlled most of Europe. Joseph Stalin, born 1878 in Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire, son of a violent, alcoholic cobbler, beaten regularly as a child, left with a permanently damaged left arm from a childhood accident. He was brilliant in school, won a scholarship to a seminary to become a priest. Instead, he became a revolutionary, a robber, a murderer. He robbed banks to fund Lenin's communist revolution. When Lenin died, Stalin outmaneuvered every rival and seized total power over the Soviet Union. By the time Hitler rose to power, Stalin had already killed millions of his own people in forced famines, purges, and labor camps. Two men, both rose from nothing. Both built empires on fear. Both killed millions. And both, secretly, terrified of each other. August 23, 1939. The world watched in shock as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two countries that hated each other, two ideologies that were supposed to be mortal enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The deal was simple on the surface: we won't attack each other. But hidden in secret clauses, they had divided Eastern Europe between themselves like two thieves splitting stolen goods. Poland would be carved up between them. The Baltic states would fall to Stalin. Hitler would take the West. The world didn't know about the secret clauses, but they knew something was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. Because 9 days after the pact was signed, Hitler invaded Poland, and World War II began. Stalin watched from Moscow, smiled, and moved his own troops into eastern Poland 2 weeks later. Two wolves, temporarily agreeing not to eat each other. But Hitler had been planning to break that agreement from the very beginning. In his book Mein Kampf, written 16 years earlier, Hitler had been completely clear about his intentions. Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in the east. In Soviet territory, the Slavic people, he wrote, were inferior, fit only to be slaves of the German master race. Stalin either didn't believe it or didn't want to believe it. That mistake would cost 27 million Soviet lives. June 22, 1941, 3 a.m. More than 3 million German soldiers, the largest military invasion force ever assembled in history, crossed the Soviet border. In the weeks before the invasion, Soviet spies had been sending urgent warnings to Moscow. British intelligence had warned Stalin directly. Even some German officers, horrified at what was coming, had sent anonymous tips to Soviet officials. Stalin had dismissed them all. He brushed off dozens of reports from Soviet spies warning that an invasion was imminent. He even accepted Hitler's cover story that the sudden presence of German troops on the Soviet border was merely to keep them out of range of British bomb strikes. When the bombs started falling and the tanks started rolling, Stalin couldn't believe it. Reports came flooding into Moscow. Stalin refused to give the order to fight back. He thought it might be a mistake, a rogue attack by German generals without Hitler's knowledge. For hours, Soviet soldiers were being slaughtered while their commanders waited for orders that weren't coming. When the reality finally hit Stalin, that Hitler had actually done it, that the pact was broken, that the invasion was real, he suffered what historians describe as a complete mental breakdown. He locked himself in his room for days. He stopped answering calls. He stopped issuing orders. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union, paralyzed by shock. By September, the Red Army had sustained some 2.5 million casualties. Cities were falling. Entire Soviet armies were being encircled and captured. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were surrendering. The German war machine was moving so fast, it seemed unstoppable. Hitler looked at his maps and laughed. "We have only to kick in the door," he said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He expected to defeat the Soviet Union in 8 to 10 weeks. He had no idea what was coming. When Stalin finally emerged from his breakdown, he was different. The shock had passed. What replaced it was something colder, harder, pure, calculating, ruthless survival instinct. He made a radio address to the Soviet people, the first time he had ever spoken to them directly. His voice, for the first time, was not that of a dictator issuing commands. He called them brothers and sisters. He called this the Great Patriotic War. He invoked history. Alexander Nevsky, who defeated the Teutonic Knights. Suvorov, who crushed Napoleon. Russia had survived foreign invasion before. Russia would survive again. And then Stalin showed just how ruthless he was willing to be. Stalin issued Order Number 270, which proclaimed that any troops who surrendered or allowed themselves to be captured were traitors and would be executed if they ever returned to the Soviet Union. Later came the even more brutal Order Number 227, not one step backward. Any troops who retreated were to be shelled or gunned down by so-called blocking detachments, special units positioned behind their own lines charged with shooting any soldier who tried to flee. Think about what that means. Soviet soldiers fighting at the front, with German bullets coming from ahead of them, and their own commanders' bullets waiting behind them. Fight or die. There was no third option. Meanwhile, Stalin ordered something extraordinary. The entire Soviet industrial machine, factories, equipment, workers, was physically moved eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt thousands of miles away. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Soviets evacuated factories east and massively increased production of planes, tanks, and other weapons. Hitler had planned for a quick war. Stalin was preparing for a long one. While the German army pushed east toward Moscow, another German force surrounded the city of Leningrad, today called St. Petersburg, then the second largest city in the Soviet Union. The plan was simple. Don't waste soldiers storming the city. Start it to death. The siege began in September 1941. It would last 872 days, nearly 2.5 years. Food supplies were cut off. Heating fuel was cut off. The city was bombed daily. By the winter of 1941, people were starving to death in the streets. The official food ration was 125 grams of bread per day. Less than half a standard bread roll. People ate cats, dogs, leather, wallpaper paste, sawdust mixed into what little flour remained. There are documented cases of cannibalism. Children continued going to school, because what else were they going to do? Teachers gave lessons while children fainted from hunger at their desks. A famous story. The Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which the composer had written during the siege in the besieged city. The concert hall was barely heated. Many of the musicians were so weak from starvation they could barely lift their instruments. They played anyway, because that's what it meant to resist. By the time the siege was finally broken in January 1944, approximately 1 million civilians had died. One city, one siege, 1 million people. October 1941. German forces were just miles from Moscow. Hitler was so confident of victory that he had already planned the victory parade through Red Square. German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But something was going wrong. The German army had been designed for blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast, decisive, over in weeks. Nobody had equipped it for a Russian winter. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees. German soldiers, in summer uniforms, were freezing to death. Engine oil was freezing solid. Guns were jamming in the cold. Tanks couldn't start. German troops were also worn down by General Winter, the nickname used to describe the deadly Soviet frost. Hitler's invasion plans called for the Germans to conquer the Soviet Union before the legendary cold could set in, but supply issues and an unexpectedly spirited resistance combined to stall the advance. And Stalin made a decision that shocked the world. On November 7th, the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, he held the traditional military parade in Red Square. With German forces literally visible from the city, soldiers marched through the square and then marched directly to the front lines a few miles away. The message was clear: Moscow will not fall. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack. The Germans were pushed back from Moscow. For the first time in the entire war, Hitler's army had been stopped, but the war was far from over. Summer 1942, Hitler made a decision that many historians consider the single greatest military mistake of World War II. He split his forces. One group was sent to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. The other was sent to capture a city on the Volga River, a city whose name, by pure coincidence, happened to be Stalingrad. For Hitler, capturing a city named after his enemy was irresistible. It became personal. For Stalin, losing a city with his name was unthinkable. It also became personal. What followed was the most brutal, most destructive, most catastrophic urban battle in the history of human warfare. The battle lasted from July 1942 to February 1943. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, pushed into the city, street by street, building by building, floor by floor, room by room. Soviet defenders, under General Vasily Chukov, refused to give ground. A famous Soviet tactic: hug the enemy. Stay so close to the German lines that German air power and artillery couldn't bomb Soviet positions without hitting their own men. Soldiers fought over single buildings for weeks. A famous grain silo changed hands 15 times. A Soviet sniper named Vasily Zaitsev was credited with over 225 kills during the battle. His duel with a German master sniper sent from Berlin, fact or legend, nobody is entirely sure, became one of the most iconic stories of the entire war. The city was reduced to absolute rubble. There were no civilians left, only fighters. And then, November 19th, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. While the Germans were focused on the city, two massive Soviet forces attacked the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies on the German flanks. Within 4 days, 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were completely surrounded. Paulus asked Hitler for permission to break out while there was still a chance. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army will hold its position, he ordered. He promised that supplies would be airlifted in. They never were, not nearly enough. German soldiers inside the encirclement began starving, freezing, running out of ammunition. More than 90,000 troops surrendered. Few made it home to Germany. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered. Hitler had just promoted him to field marshal because no German field marshal had ever surrendered. He expected Paulus to die fighting. Paulus surrendered anyway. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. And with it, the entire direction of World War II changed forever. 3/4 of all German military and material losses in the Second World War occurred on the Eastern Front. Germany would never truly recover from Stalingrad. July 1943, Hitler needed a victory. After Stalingrad, morale in Germany was collapsing. He needed to prove the war could still be won. He planned Operation Citadel, a massive attack on a Soviet position near the city of Kursk, a bulge in the front line that German forces could pinch off encircle, and destroy. It would be the largest tank offensive in history. But the Soviets knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence, including a famous spy network called the Lucy Ring, had obtained detailed information about the German plans. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov convinced Stalin to do something unusual. Don't attack first. Let the Germans come, and then crush them. It was the largest tank battle of all time, involving some 6,000 tanks. The Soviets had built the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. 8 defensive lines, over 1 million mines, thousands of anti-tank guns, hundreds of miles of trenches. When the Germans attacked, they drove straight into a trap. For every German advance, Soviet defenses absorbed the blow and held. After 2 weeks, the Germans had achieved nothing, and the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. The Germans were pushed back, and back, and back. They would never mount another major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, the war moved in only one direction: west. The Soviet war machine, now enormous, now experienced, now equipped with American and British supplies flowing through the Lend-Lease program, began rolling westward. Country by country, city by city, Ukraine was liberated. Belarus was liberated. The Baltic states were liberated. Romania, one of Germany's allies, switched sides. Poland was crossed, and the Red Army entered Germany itself. Hitler, in his underground bunker in Berlin, refused to accept reality. He moved armies that no longer existed on his maps. He ordered counterattacks from divisions that had been destroyed. His generals were terrified to tell him the truth, because people who gave Hitler bad news had a habit of being shot. The Red Army responded by giving no quarter during the Soviet push to Berlin in 1945. The battle for Berlin began in April 1945. It was savage, street by street, the same way Stalingrad had been fought, except now it was German streets and Soviet soldiers doing the advancing. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the greatest Soviet commander of the war, directed the assault personally. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops just blocks from his bunker, Adolf Hitler shot himself. His body was burned in the courtyard above. 1 week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Now let's talk about what this war actually cost, because numbers on a page don't do it justice. But we have to try. Of the estimated 70 to 85 million deaths in World War II, around 30 million occurred on the Eastern Front, including 9 million children. Let that sink in. 9 million children. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people, soldiers and civilians combined. There was almost no Soviet family that did not lose someone. Germany lost approximately 5 to 6 million soldiers on the Eastern Front alone. The city of Leningrad, 1 million civilians dead in the siege. The city of Stalingrad, almost completely destroyed. Barely a building left standing. Warsaw, almost completely demolished deliberately by the Germans. Entire villages burned to the ground with their populations inside. This was not just a war. This was an attempt at annihilation. And on both sides, the leadership used their own people as fuel. Hitler sent German soldiers to die for his pride. For Stalingrad, a name on a map that had become personal. Stalin had a notorious habit of imprisoning or killing anyone who brought him bad news. Red Army soldiers who retreated were executed by the NKVD. Confronted with the prospect of starving to death in a German camp if they surrendered, or facing a firing squad if they retreated, Soviet soldiers generally preferred fighting to the death. Soviet soldiers were trapped between 2 deaths and chose the more honorable one. Here's a question that history books rarely ask directly. Did Stalin actually win? Yes, the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany. Yes, the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. Yes, Hitler died in a bunker while Stalin lived to rule for 8 more years. By every military measure, Stalin won. But what did he win? The Soviet Union had only twice the population of Germany, but it was suffering a casualty rate more than 2.5 times the German rate. The Soviet economy was shattered. Entire regions of the country had been burned to the ground. The male population had been devastated, an entire generation of young men gone. And Stalin, who had won the war, went home and continued doing exactly what he had done before. The purges continued. The labor camps continued. The paranoia continued. People who had fought heroically in the war were sometimes arrested on return, because Stalin feared anyone who had seen the West, anyone who had become a hero, anyone who might be more popular than him. Soviet POWs who had survived German camps were sent to Soviet camps for investigation, because Stalin's order had declared them traitors for being captured. The men who saved the Soviet Union were imprisoned by the Soviet Union. And Hitler? He left behind a continent in ruins, 6 million Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, and a Germany so completely destroyed that it was divided between the victorious powers for the next 45 years. His 1,000-year Reich lasted exactly 12 years. The war between Hitler and Stalin was the most destructive conflict in human history. More than 80% of all combat during the Second World War took place on the Eastern Front. And yet, in the West, it is the least taught, least discussed, least understood part of World War II. Most people in America and Europe know D-Day. They know Normandy. They know the liberation of Paris. They don't know Stalingrad. They don't know Kursk. They don't know Leningrad. They don't know that by the time American soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Soviet Union had already been fighting, bleeding, and dying for 3 years, and had already broken the back of the German military. This was a war that showed the world what happens when hatred is given power, when ideology is placed above human life, when two men, each convinced of their own righteousness, are willing to spend other people's lives like coins. Hitler wanted to destroy. Stalin wanted to survive. Neither cared how many had to die for that goal. Between them, they killed more people than any two individuals in recorded history. And the world has never fully recovered from what happened in those 4 years between June 1941 and May 1945. Remember the names of the dead. Remember what hatred and power looks like. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.